in the deep, velvet quiet of the early morning, long before the sun has fully risen above the misty peaks of the Japanese mountains. There lies a profound stillness that settles over the land like a heavy, comforting blanket. Imagine a room, dimly lit by the soft, pale gray light of dawn, where the air feels cool and motionless, and the only sound is the rhythmic, slow breathing of the world waking up. In the center of this room, resting upon a polished, black lacquered stand, lies a sword, a katana, curved and elegant, sleeping inside its wooden sheath. This object, often thought of as an instrument of chaos, is now the very anchor of peace in the room. Dust motes dance slowly in the single beam of light that pierces through the paper screens of the shoji doors, swirling around the resting blade in a hypnotic, endless waltz. For centuries, this steel was forged for the clash of battle, designed to sing the sharp metal song of war. But here, in this moment, it represents something entirely different. It represents the silence. It is a heavy, deliberate silence, the kind that exists not because there is nothing to say, but because there is no longer a need to shout. The samurai who owns this sword is nearby, perhaps sitting in meditation, or perhaps simply watching the steam rise from a cup of morning tea, and he looks at the weapon not with an itch to draw it, but with a deep, resonating contentment that it remains hidden. The handle, wrapped in intricate silk braid, sits untouched, gathering the quiet energy of the room. This is the era where the armor gathers dust in the corner, not out of neglect, but out of a safety that has finally arrived. The silence behind the sword is thicker than the steel itself. It is a history that has decided to rest, a storm that has finally blown itself out, leaving behind only the calm ripple of a tranquil lake. As we begin this journey into the past, let your mind rest on that image of the sheathed sword, perfectly still, perfectly balanced, holding its breath in a world that has finally learned how to sleep. The silence that we spoke of did not arrive all at once, falling from the sky like a sudden curtain, but rather it crept across the land of Japan slowly, much like the heavy, low-hanging mist that rolls off the mountains and settles into the valleys after a long autumn rain. To understand the peace of the samurai, we must first understand the sound that preceded it, a sound that reached its crescendo on a foggy October morning in the year 1600, at a place called Sekigahara. It was here, in a narrow valley surrounded by dark, wooded hills, that the destiny of the nation was decided. Yet as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months following that momentous clash, the roar of the conflict began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves of thatched roofs and the rustling of wind through the cedar trees. The echoes of Sekigahara were not merely sounds of metal and fury. They were the vibrations of an era coming to an end, a chaotic frequency that was slowly being dampened by the wet earth. Imagine the valley in the days after the armies had departed, when the ground was churned into thick, dark mud, and the heavy gray clouds refused to part, keeping the world in a state of twilight. The rain fell incessantly, washing away the footprints of thousands of men, scrubbing the stones clean, and softening the jagged edges of the landscape. This rain was a cleanser, a natural mechanism to reset the world, and as it fell, it seemed to whisper that the time of constant strife was over. For the samurai who survived, the fading of these echoes was a physical sensation. They could feel the tension leaving their shoulders, a tension they had carried since birth, inherited from fathers and grandfathers who had known only war. Now, as the great unifier Tokugawa Ieyasu established his shogunate in the east, a new order began to solidify, motionless and sturdy like a great pine tree. The roads that had once thrummed with the marching of boots and the galloping of cavalry now grew quieter, hosting instead the slow, deliberate footsteps of merchants and travelers. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer, once ringing out day and night to forge blades and armor, began to change its rhythm, turning now to the fashioning of farming tools, nails for building, and pots for cooking. It was a gradual transformation of soundscape, where the sharp, high-pitched clang of war was replaced by the dull, comforting thud of construction and cultivation. In the provinces, the castles that stood as fortresses of defiance began to change their purpose. No longer were they purely defensive shells, but they became administrative centers, looming silent and majestic against the skyline. The moats, once filled with murky water to deter enemies, became serene ponds where carp swam lazily near the surface, their orange and gold scales catching the light, undisturbed by the shadow of arrows. The wind that blew through the high mountain passes no longer carried the scent of smoke and burning timber. Instead, it carried the smell of wet soil, pine needles, and the faint, sweet aroma of rice cooking in distant villages. This transition was not immediate for the warriors. It was a slow fading, like a bell that has been struck and continues to hum for a long time before finally going completely still. They sat in their homes, listening to the rain, waiting for a call to arms that would never come. And in that waiting, they began to notice the world around them for the first time in generations. They noticed how the light changed on the sliding paper doors as the sun moved across the sky. They noticed the specific chirp of the crickets in the tall grass, and they noticed the profound, heavy silence that filled the spaces between their heartbeats. The echoes of Sekigahara traveled far, bouncing off the mountains and dissipating into the sea, becoming weaker with each passing season, until they were nothing more than a memory, a ghost story told in hushed tones. The mud of the battlefield dried and was reclaimed by nature. Grass grew over the scars in the earth, covering the history with a blanket of green. And wildflowers bloomed in places where men had once stood in defiance. The fading was complete not when the last sword was sheathed, but when the samurai looked out at the rain-soaked landscape and realized that the silence was not an absence of noise, but a presence of peace, a new reality that stretched out before them like an endless, calm ocean. This was the world that was waking up from a nightmare of fire, cooling down, settling into the earth, and breathing a long, slow sigh of relief that the storm had finally passed. As the years drifted by like fallen leaves floating down a slow-moving river, a profound and peculiar realization began to settle upon the samurai class, a weight not of armor but of time itself, pressing gently against their chests as they woke morning after morning to a world that no longer required their fury. This was the dawn of an era defined by a strange and heavy quietude, where thousands of men who had been bred, trained, and spiritually sculpted for the singular purpose of combat found themselves standing in the center of a silent garden, holding a sword that had no enemy to strike. Imagine the sensation of walking out onto a porch in the early morning, the wooden planks cool and smooth beneath bare feet, and looking out at a horizon that is completely devoid of smoke signals or the dust of marching armies, seeing instead only the mist clinging to the pine trees and the farmers already knee-deep in the rice paddies, moving with a rhythmic, peaceful slowness that felt almost alien to the warrior's eye. The armor, constructed of lacquered plates and bound with strong silk cords, sat in the corner of the room on its wooden stand, appearing less like a tool of survival and more like a ghost of a past life, a hollow shell watching its master with empty eye slits. Dust began to settle on the intricate lacing, not the dust of the road, but the soft, gray dust of domestic stillness, accumulating day by day, layer by microscopic layer, marking the passage of time more accurately than any clock. For these men, the transition was not merely physical but deeply internal, a quiet crisis of identity that played out in the long, stretching hours of the afternoon when the sun moved sluggishly across the tatami mats. They were a warrior class without a war, a standing army with nowhere to march, and this lack of external conflict forced them to turn inward, to navigate the vast and often terrifying landscape of their own boredom. The adrenaline that once surged through their veins at the sound of a conch shell was replaced by the slow, steady pulse of routine, a routine that consisted of administrative duties, checking the quality of rice stores, overseeing the repair of castle walls that would never again be besieged, and simply waiting. Waiting became a state of being, a texture of life that they had to learn to wear as comfortably as their robes. They would sit for hours, feeling the texture of the fabric against their skin, listening to the wind rattle the bamboo fences. And in that listening, they began to understand the weight of peace. It was heavy, denser than steel, demanding a different kind of strength. The strength to sit still, to be present, to let the mind unspool its tightness without snapping. The hands that were calloused from gripping the hilt of the katana now found themselves resting idly on knees or holding a fan, and the fingers learned to trace the grain of the wood, to feel the coolness of polished stone, to appreciate the delicate fragility of a paper screen. Without the constant threat of death, the senses began to open up to the subtleties of life, the way the light turned golden in the late autumn, the smell of old paper and ink, the sound of a distant temple bell tolling the hour. Yet there was a lingering melancholy, a sense of being a relic in one's own time, like a ship stranded on a calm sea with no wind to fill its sails. They walked the streets of the castle towns, their two swords still tucked into their obies as symbols of their station, but the blades were peace-bonded, tied shut with cords to signify that they would not be drawn. This physical binding was a mirror of their internal state, a restraint placed upon their very nature. They were guardians of a peace that rendered them obsolete, and in this paradox, they found a slow, drifting kind of solitude. They watched the seasons change with an intensity they had never afforded before. The cherry blossoms falling in spring were no longer a metaphor for a short life dropped in battle, but simply beautiful, tragic petals coating the ground in pink snow, to be swept away by the wind. The summer heat was no longer a trial to be endured in heavy gear, but a warmth that slowed the world down, making the cicadas buzz with a lazy, hypnotic rhythm that lulled the mind into a trance. Autumn brought the red maples and the harvest, a time of accounting and preparation, and winter brought the deep snows that silenced the world completely, burying the roads and the fields in white, creating a blank canvas upon which the samurai could project their thoughts. In this long, extended silence, the warrior began to dissolve, and something else began to take shape, something softer, more contemplative. A figure who looked at the moon not to gauge the visibility for a night raid, but simply to admire its pale, perfect roundness hanging in the black void. The fire that had burned in their bellies was banked down to glowing embers, providing a steady, gentle warmth rather than a consuming blaze. They learned to walk slower, to breathe deeper, to let the days flow into one another without the sharp punctuation of violence. It was a time of settling, of the sediment in a stirred glass of water finally sinking to the bottom, leaving the water clear and still. The warrior class, stripped of its primary function, became a class of observers, of silent watchers who stood guard over a tranquility they had fought to create, but now had to learn to endure. The sword remained at the hip, a constant companion, but its song was no longer a scream. It was a hum, a low vibration of potential energy that would never be released, trapped in the amber of a peaceful age. And so they sat and they breathed, and they watched the shadows lengthen, letting the silence of the era seep into their bones, transforming them from men of war into men of the quiet, endless wait. With the heavy steel of the katana resting silently in its scabbard, gathering the slow dust of a peaceful age, the hands of the samurai, once calloused from the friction of the hilt and the vibration of impact, began to seek a new instrument of purpose, finding it not in the armory, but in the quiet, cedar-scented air of the study. This transition from the blade to the brush was not a surrender of power, but a transmutation of it, a shifting of focus from the immediate, bloody resolution of conflict to the enduring, fluid permanence of ink on paper. Imagine the scene of a warrior who has spent his youth learning the precise angles of a killing strike, now sitting, cross-legged on a tatami mat. The room dim and cool, illuminated only by the soft, diffused light filtering through the paper shoji screens. Before him lies a different kind of battlefield, a vast, terrifying expanse of pristine white washi paper, waiting to be conquered not by force, but by the subtle, controlled pressure of a bamboo brush. The ritual begins with the preparation of the ink, a process that is itself a form of deep meditation, a slow, hypnotic grinding of the sumi stick against the stone suzuri. Back and forth, round and round, the black stick moves against the stone, adding water drop by drop, creating a dark, viscous pool that smells of pine soot and earth, a scent that is ancient and grounding. This grinding sound is rhythmic, a dull, scraping whisper that fills the room, quieting the mind, washing away the chaotic thoughts of the outside world until there is nothing left but the black liquid and the waiting paper. For the samurai, this was the new discipline, the way of Bunbu Ryodo, the dual path of the pen and the sword. But in this era of prolonged peace, the pen began to weigh heavier than the sword ever had. To hold the brush required a different kind of strength, a strength that resided in the stillness of the wrist and the calmness of the breath. There is no armor here to protect against a mistake. Once the brush touches the paper, the mark is made, permanent and unforgiving, much like a cut in battle. But here the stakes are intellectual, spiritual. The ink flows from the bristles like a black river, capturing the very spirit of the writer in its drying path. They wrote reports on rice yields. They transcribed the Confucian classics. They composed poetry that captured the fleeting sadness of a wilting flower. And in doing so, they transferred their warrior spirit into the administration of a nation. The energy that was once directed outward to destroy was now directed inward to create and to order. The bureaucracy of the shogunate became a vast, intricate machine, and the samurai were its gears, their swords merely symbols of status while their brushes did the actual work of governing. Hours turned into days as they sat hunched over low tables, the only sound the scratch of the brush and the turning of pages. A soundscape of immense productivity hidden within a wrapper of total silence. The precise, angular strokes of the kanji characters demanded the same focus as a duel. A moment of hesitation would ruin the flow. A lapse in concentration would break the harmony of the line. They learned that words could build bridges that steel could not, that a well-written letter could dissolve a feud that a duel would only prolong. The power dynamics shifted from the physical to the cerebral. And the samurai who could quote the classics and navigate the complex etiquette of the court became more powerful than the one who could merely swing a blade. This was a quiet revolution, fought in the hushed corridors of castles and the private studies of residences, where the weapon of choice was a stick of bamboo and the blood was black ink. As they wrote, they found a different kind of rhythm to life, one that was linear and cumulative, built page by page, scroll by scroll. A legacy of paper that would survive long after their swords had rusted away. The brush became an extension of the arm, just as the sword had been, but it connected them to a world of ideas rather than a world of flesh. They studied the flow of the ink, watching it bleed slightly into the fibers of the handmade paper, creating jagged, organic edges that resembled the coastlines of the country they served. It was a practice of patience, of surrendering to the medium, of letting the hand follow the mind without interference. In the winter, they would warm their hands over braziers of charcoal to keep the fingers nimble. In the summer, they would wipe sweat from their brows. careful not to let a single drop fall onto the precious documents. This was the boring, beautiful, monotonous reality of the piece they had won. A life measured not in heads taken, but in volumes written in the quiet. Scratching symphony of 1,000 brushes moving in unison across 1,000 sheets of paper, rewriting the destiny of Japan, one stroke at a time. The aggression of the warrior was sublimated into the assertiveness of the calligrapher, the thrust of the spear becoming the sharp, decisive end of a character, the parry becoming the hook, the block becoming the stop. It was a dance of the hand, small, contained, and infinitely complex, performed in the silence of a room where the only witness was the paper itself. The might of the pen lay in its ability to preserve, to record, to stabilize, creating a structure of laws and records that held the society together more firmly than any army ever could. And so the samurai sat, the ink drying on their fingers, their eyes tracing the black lines, finding in the stark contrast of black and white a peace that the grays of the battlefield had never offered. Realizing that to govern a land in peace required a sharper mind and a steadier hand than it ever took to conquer it in war. As the ink dried, turning from a wet, glistening sheen to a deep, matte black that seemed to absorb the very light of the room, the samurai would often pause, the brush hovering in the air like a suspended breath, to contemplate the permanence of what had just been created. For unlike the slash of a sword which destroys in an instant, the stroke of a brush builds a legacy that defies the erosion of time. This act of writing became a bridge spanning the gap between the chaotic past and the structured present, leading them into the depths of archives and libraries, where the air was thick with the scent of cedar wood and aging paper, a smell that became as familiar to them as the scent of horse sweat and iron once was. In these quiet repositories of knowledge, surrounded by walls of scrolls and bound books, the warriors became scholars, diving into the histories of their clans, tracing lineages back through the centuries, ensuring that the names of their ancestors were preserved not just in oral tales told around campfires, but in the immutable record of the written word. They meticulously chronicled the affairs of the domain, recording the rise and fall of river levels, the yield of the harvest down to the last grain of rice, and the intricate, often mundane legal disputes between neighbors, tasks that might seem tedious to the restless spirit, but which offered a profound, repetitive comfort to a mind seeking order. The silence of the library was different from the silence of the ambush. It was a safe, enclosing silence protected by thick walls and heavy doors, where the only danger was a spilled ink pot or a misplaced character. As they read the works of ancient Chinese philosophers or the poetry of court nobles, their minds expanded beyond the rigid confines of the battlefield, exploring landscapes of thought and emotion that had been closed to them during the years of constant war. They learned to appreciate the subtlety of a metaphor, the elegance of a well-turned phrase, and the power of a logical argument, realizing that a sharp intellect could maneuver through the complexities of the shogunate politics far more effectively than a sharp blade. The correspondence between samurai in distant provinces transformed from brief, urgent messages of troop movements to long, eloquent letters discussing the changing seasons, the state of their gardens, and the nuances of tea, creating a web of connection across Japan that was woven from words rather than alliances of war. This epistolary friendship allowed them to share their solitude, to confess their struggles with the quiet life, and to find solidarity in the shared experience of the brush. The physical act of sitting for hours on end, Seiza style with the spine straight and the shoulders relaxed, became a new form of physical training, a discipline of endurance that tested their willpower as much as holding a heavy spear ever did, for the battle was now against the stiffness of the joints and the wandering of the mind. They would watch the shadows of the pine trees lengthen across the floorboards, marking the passage of the afternoon, their world shrinking down to the square of paper in front of them. A white void that demanded to be filled with truth and beauty. The brush became a conduit for their kai, or spirit energy, flowing down through the arm and out onto the page, so that a master swordsman could be recognized by the strength and vigor of his calligraphy, the characters leaping off the page with a vitality that mirrored his martial prowess. In this way, the warrior did not disappear. He was merely translated into a different medium, his lethality softened into literacy, his aggression refined into art. The mundane bureaucracy of the Edo period, with its endless forms, permits, and ledgers, became the new training ground. A place where patience was forged, and where the ego was slowly worn away by the repetitive friction of duty. They became guardians of history, custodians of culture, and architects of a civil society, building the foundations of a peace that would last for over 200 years. Not with the mortar of blood, but with the paste of rice and the ink of soot. As the candle flickered low in the lantern, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, the samurai would finally clean his brush, washing away the black ink in a bowl of water until it ran clear, a daily ritual of purification that signaled the end of the labor. He would roll up the scroll, tie it with a silk ribbon, and place it gently on the shelf alongside thousands of others, a small, silent contribution to the great mountain of history. The pen had indeed become mightier, not because it conquered lands, but because it conquered the chaos of the human heart, providing a vessel for the warrior's energy that created rather than destroyed, leaving behind a world that was richer, deeper, and infinitely more understandable than the one they had found. The room would then fall completely silent, save for the sound of the wind outside and the settling of the wooden beams, as the warrior scholar extinguished the light and sat in the darkness, listening to the quiet hum of a nation at peace, a piece he held in his hands, stained with ink, heavy with the weight of words. The transition was not marked by a grand ceremony or a sudden proclamation, but rather by the slow, grinding turn of a massive wheel, shifting the entire weight of the samurai class from the open, muddy expanses of the battlefield to the enclosed, hushed, and dimly lit corridors of the administrative castle wings. Imagine, if you will, the physical sensation of this change, beginning with the clothing itself, for the warrior no longer donned the heavy, flexible plates of iron and leather designed to deflect arrows and absorb the blows of spears, but instead, he stepped into the rigid, starch-stiffened formality of the kamishimo, the ceremonial dress of the Edo period bureaucrat. The wide, wing-like shoulders of the hemp vest extended out far beyond his physical frame, creating an imposing silhouette but severely restricting the range of motion. A physical reminder that the time for swinging arms and wild movements was over, replaced by a time of constrained, precise, and deliberate gestures. Every morning, thousands of samurai across Japan would wake not to the sound of a war drum, but to the crowing of a rooster or the soft shuffling of servants. And they would begin the slow process of dressing for office, smoothing out the pleats of their hakama trousers with obsessive care, ensuring that every fold was perfectly aligned. For in this new world, a disheveled appearance was a defeat as serious as a lost duel. They would then make their commute, walking the familiar path from their modest homes in the castle town, their sandals crunching softly on the gravel, moving through the concentric rings of the castle defenses, passing over moats where the water was still and dark, reflecting the mossy stones of the massive walls that were built to withstand sieges that would never come. As they crossed the wooden bridges and entered the main gates, they were not met by the chaos of soldiers preparing for a sortie, but by the profound, organized silence of a government at work. They removed their footwear at the entrance, stepping onto the cool, polished wood of the castle hallways, their tabi socks making a soft, sliding sound that echoed faintly in the long, empty corridors. The smell of the air changed here. It lost the scent of the outside world, the earth, the rain, the horses, and took on the dry, dusty aroma of old wood, tatami straw, and accumulated paper. Entering the vast administrative halls, known as the Goyo-baya, they would take their assigned places in rows that stretched deep into the room, seated according to a strict and unbreakable hierarchy of rank. The room was vast, supported by thick pillars of cypress, and despite containing dozens, sometimes hundreds of men, it was shrouded in a heavy, blanketed quietude, broken only by the rhythmic sounds of industry, the grinding of ink, the rustling of pages turning, the scratch of the brush, and the dull, repetitive thud of the hanko seal stamping a document. This was the new battlefield, a landscape of ledgers and registers where the enemy was not a rival clan, but chaos, disorder, and inaccuracy. The samurai, men whose ancestors had charged into hails of arrows, now bent their heads over low wooden tables, squinting in the filtered light to track the movement of rice, the lifeblood of the economy. They calculated yields from distant provinces, converting bales of rice into gold equivalent, tracking the taxes owed by thousands of villages. A task of mind-numbing repetition that required a fortitude of a different kind. Hour after hour, they would sit in the seiza position, legs folded beneath them, a posture that cut off circulation and demanded immense physical discipline to maintain without fidgeting, turning their bodies into statues of endurance. The work was endless and cyclical. As soon as one harvest was accounted for, the projections for the next began. As soon as a dispute over water rights between two farmers was resolved, another regarding a property line would emerge. They became experts in the minutiae of civil life, learning the precise legal language needed to draft edicts, the exact protocol for receiving a petition, and the delicate art of refusing a request without causing offense. The sword at their hip, once the primary tool of their trade, became a cumbersome obstruction in the tight spaces of the office, often bumping against the desk or the doorframe, a constant, awkward reminder of their mismatched purpose. Yet they wore it still, a symbol of authority that commanded respect even as they performed the work of clerks. The boredom of the bureaucracy was a physical weight, a thick, gelatinous atmosphere that seemed to slow time itself, making the afternoon hours stretch out into infinity. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the upper windows, moving with agonizing slowness, mesmerizing the weary scribe who paused for a moment to rest his eyes. There was a meditative quality to the monotony, a rhythm to the stamping of papers, dip, press, lift, dip, press, lift, that could induce a trance-like state, washing away the ego and leaving only the function. They were the gears in the great clockwork of the shogunate, turning slowly, reliably, invisibly, ensuring that the peace of the realm was maintained not by the spilling of blood, but by the accurate keeping of records. They dealt with the logistics of road maintenance, ensuring the posting stations had fresh horses. They oversaw the repair of river embankments to prevent flooding, and they managed the stockpiles of grain against the threat of famine. It was unglamorous, invisible work, the kind that leaves no songs or legends, but it was the work that allowed the population to sleep safely at night. The warriors' vigilance was repurposed into an obsessive attention to detail, where once they scanned the horizon for enemy flags, they now scanned columns of numbers for discrepancies, hunting down errors with the same lethal intent they would have once used to hunt a foe. The walls of the office absorbed the years of their lives, the wood darkening with age and the smoke of oil lamps, bearing silent witness to the transformation of a class of killers into a class of administrators. As the sun began to set, casting long, melancholic shadows across the tatami, the samurai would finally lay down their brushes, their fingers stained with ink, their shoulders stiff, and prepare to leave the fortress of paper they had built, stepping back out into the twilight with the quiet satisfaction of having fought a battle against entropy and won, one document at a time. The silence of the administrative chambers was occasionally punctuated by the sharp, clicking sound of the soroban, the Japanese abacus, which became the new weapon of choice for the samurai class. Its wooden beads sliding back and forth on bamboo rods with a precision that rivaled the strike of a katana. Mastering this instrument required a dexterity of the fingers and a sharpness of the mind that was surprisingly demanding, turning the abstract concept of mathematics into a tactile, rhythmic practice that echoed through the quiet rooms like the falling of heavy rain. The samurai, who had once measured their worth by the number of enemies defeated, now found themselves measuring the wealth of their lord in koku of rice, meticulously counting the bales that were stacked high in the granaries, checking for mold, for rats, for the slightest discrepancy that could spell disaster for the domain's finances. This shift to the soroban represented a fundamental change in the physics of their existence. Where war was chaotic, unpredictable, and explosive, accounting was ordered, linear, and cumulative. A world where everything had a place and every number had to balance. They would spend days debating the cost of timber for repairing a bridge that had washed away in the spring thaw, analyzing the quality of the wood, the wages of the carpenters, and the transport costs with a seriousness that suggested the fate of the nation hung in the balance, which, in a way, it did. This was a war of logistics, a battle against scarcity and waste, fought with the weapons of frugality and foresight. The bureaucracy was also a labyrinth of social etiquette, where the exchange of documents was governed by a complex dance of bowing and honorifics, a minefield of potential insults, where a misplaced word could cause more damage than a clumsy spar. They navigated these treacherous waters with a stoic face, repressing the urge to cut through the red tape with a blade, learning instead the art of patience, the ability to wait for a seal of approval that might take weeks to arrive. The seasons outside the thick walls of the castle would change, the vibrant green of summer fading into the rusty browns of autumn, the white silence of winter melting into the mud of spring. But inside the Goyobeya, the season was eternal, a perpetual state of administrative stasis, where the light was always dim and the air always smelled of ink. They dealt with the petitions of the common people, reading through endless scrolls of complaints about neighbors, requests for tax relief, and disputes over inheritance, acting as judges and mediators in the petty dramas of village life. It was here, in the resolution of these small, mundane conflicts, that the samurai found a new kind of honor, the honor of fairness, of using their authority to protect the weak not from bandits, but from the indifference of the system. They became the immune system of the shogunate, constantly patrolling the arteries of the state to remove blockages and ensure the smooth flow of commerce and justice. The work was physically sedentary but mentally exhausting, leaving them at the end of the day with a fatigue that was deep in the bones, a tiredness born not of exertion but of restraint. They would rub their eyes, red from straining in the low light, and massage their stiff knees, feeling the ache of a life spent kneeling on tatami mats. Yet in this repetition, there was a strange, hypnotic comfort, a sense of belonging to a vast, intricate machine that was greater than themselves. The stacks of paper that towered on their desks were not just records. They were the physical manifestation of peace, proof that the land was stable enough to be counted, measured, and managed. As they walked home under the light of the moon, the sounds of the castle town settling down for the night, the closing of shutters, the barking of a distant dog, the song of a night watchman, felt different to them. These were the sounds of a world they were sustaining through their boredom, a world that could sleep soundly because they remained awake. Counting, checking, and recording. The transition was complete not when they forgot how to use their swords, for they never did, but when they realized that the stroke of a brush and the slide of an abacus bead were the true guardians of the realm, holding the chaos of the world at bay with the sheer, unyielding weight of bureaucracy. To understand the deepest reservoir of peace available to the samurai, one must leave behind the grand halls of the castle and the busy streets of the town, stepping instead onto a narrow, winding path made of uneven stepping stones, glistening with the dampness of morning dew, that leads away from the world of men and into the secluded, shaded sanctuary of the tea garden. This is the realm of Chado, the way of tea, a practice that became the spiritual anchor for the warrior class, a ritual so profound and all-consuming that it could stop time itself, shrinking the universe down to the size of a tatami mat and the rim of a ceramic bowl. The journey begins not when the tea is poured, but the moment the samurai steps onto the roji, the garden path, which is designed to sever the connection with the outside world. A physical and psychological threshold where the concerns of rank, politics, and war are shed like old skin. The air here is different, cooler and fragrant with the scent of damp moss, pine needles, and wet stone, a silence that is heavy and expectant. As he walks, he must watch his footing, forcing his mind to be present in the immediate moment, each step a deliberate act of mindfulness. At the end of the path stands the chashitsu, the tea house, a structure of humble, rustic beauty, often made of unpainted wood, bamboo, and mud, designed to look like a hermit's hut. Embracing the aesthetic of wabi-sabi, the appreciation of the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete. Before entering, there is a crucial ritual at the tsukubai, a low stone basin filled with clear water. The samurai kneels, taking a wooden ladle to wash his hands and rinse his mouth, the cold water shocking the senses awake, physically cleansing him of the dust of the mundane world. Then comes the most significant act of all, approaching the entrance of the tea house, which is often a small, square door known as the nijiriguchi, so low that one cannot walk through it upright. Here, the samurai must do the unthinkable. He must reach to his waist and untie the silk cords that bind his two swords, the very symbols of his soul and status, and place them on a rack outside, leaving them under the eaves, exposed to the elements. He is now weaponless, stripped of his armor and his rank, a man just like any other. To enter the room, he must crawl on his hands and knees, a posture of ultimate humility, bowing his head low to pass through the frame, rebirthing himself into a space of pure equality and tranquility. Inside, the room is dim, lit only by the soft, filtered light passing through the paper shoji screens, creating a twilight atmosphere that blurs the edges of reality. The space is small, intimate, usually 4.5 tatami mats in size, forcing those within to be acutely aware of one another's presence. The air smells of tatami straw, faint incense, and the charcoal fire burning in the sunken hearth. In the center of the room sits the host, silent and composed, and upon the fire rests the iron kettle known as the kama. The water inside is just beginning to boil, producing a sound described by tea masters as matsukaze, or the wind whistling through pine trees, a continuous, soft hissing sound that covers the silence like a warm blanket. The samurai sits in seiza, his knees on the woven mats, and simply listens. There is no urgency here, no deadline, no enemy. He looks toward the tokonoma, the alcove where a single scroll of calligraphy or a simple arrangement of wildflowers, chabana, is displayed. The flowers are not arranged to look perfect, but to look as if they are still growing in the field, capturing the fleeting beauty of nature. The host begins the ritual, and every movement is a choreographed dance of efficiency and grace, honed over decades of practice. He takes a silk cloth, the fukusa, and inspects it, folds it, and wipes the lacquer tea caddy, the motion slow, circular, and hypnotic. The sound of the cloth swishing against the lacquer is barely audible, yet in the quiet of the room, it sounds loud and crisp. The host then picks up the bamboo scoop, chashaku, and measures the green matcha powder into the bowl, the fine dust settling like a miniature green mountain. Hot water is ladled from the kettle, the steam rising in curling ribbons that vanish into the shadows of the ceiling. Then comes the sound of the bamboo whisk, the chasen beating the water and tea together, a rapid, rhythmic scratching sound, whisk, 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 frothing the liquid into a jade-green foam. This sound is the heartbeat of the ceremony, a frantic energy contained within a small bowl, transforming the bitter powder into a smooth, thick elixir. When the bowl is finally placed before the samurai, he bows, accepting it with both hands, feeling the warmth of the rough ceramic radiating into his palms. He turns the bowl clockwise twice, admiring its texture, its flaws, the way the glaze has cracked in the kiln, seeing the universe in its imperfections. He raises it to his lips and takes a sip. The taste is grassy, bitter, yet sweet, a shock of flavor that brings him entirely into the now. In this moment, holding the warm bowl, surrounded by the smell of incense and the sound of the boiling kettle, the samurai realizes that there is no past and no future, only this sip of tea. The battles of history fade away, the arguments of the court dissolve, and the only truth that remains is the warmth in his hands and the green tea on his tongue. It is a meditation in motion, a practice of finding the infinite in the finite, of realizing that peace is not found in the absence of war, but in the presence of mind. As the bitterness of the matcha fades into a lingering sweetness at the back of the throat, the samurai lowers the bowl slowly, treating it with the reverence due to a sacred relic. For in the philosophy of tea, the object is as spirited as the man holding it, possessing a soul forged in fire and earth. He takes a folded piece of paper, the kaishi, from his kimono sleeve and wipes the rim of the bowl where his lips touched it, a gesture of hygiene but also of profound respect for the next guest. Acknowledging that while they are separate individuals, they share this single vessel of communion in a bond of trust. He passes the bowl to the man beside him, and in this exchange, there is a silent language spoken, a transfer of warmth that requires no syllable to be uttered. Only the gentle friction of skin against ceramic. The bowl itself, perhaps a rough-hewn piece of raku where, black and uneven, feels heavy and solid, its surface pitted like the landscape of an ancient moon, and as it passes from hand to hand, the samurai observes the hands of his companions, hands that once gripped spears and reins now cradling the clay with infinite tenderness, fascinated by the texture of the glaze. The conversation in the taroom is sparse, limited to strict formalities or quiet praise for the utensils, yet the connection is deeper than any boisterous banquet filled with sake and shouting. They speak of the scroll hanging in the alcove, perhaps discussing the flow of the ink or the meaning of the Zen phrase, their voices low and murmuring, blending with the sound of the wind outside to create a single, harmonious soundscape. The charcoal in the hearth settles with a soft click, sending a tiny spray of orange sparks up against the black iron of the kettle, a fleeting firework display that only they witness, a reminder of the heat that sustains the ritual. The water continues its soft, simmering song, the matsukaze, which seems to pull the mind further away from the rigidity of daily life, washing over the thoughts like a gentle tide. In this small, enclosed space, the hierarchy of the outside world is completely dissolved. A powerful daimyo might sit beside a merchant or a simple monk, and here, in the dim light, they are equals, united by the appreciation of the incomplete and the humble. This is the principle of wa, or harmony, the first of the four spirits of tea, where the boundaries between self and other, between man and nature, are softened and blurred until they are indistinguishable. The samurai closes his eyes for a moment, listening to the whisking of the next bowl, a sound that is crisp and frantic like the beating of a bird's wing, yet it produces a foam of perfect stillness. He reflects on the concept of ikigo iki, one time, one meeting, the realization that this specific gathering with these specific people, in this specific light, will never happen again in exactly the same way. Even if they all meet again tomorrow, they will be one day older, the weather will be different, their minds will have changed. Therefore, this moment is unique in the history of the universe and must be cherished with total intensity. This thought brings a poignant, bittersweet quality to the piece, a recognition of the fleeting nature of all things, which is the very essence of the samurai's existence, resonating with the impermanence of the cherry blossom. The light filtering through the paper screens begins to change, shifting from the cool white of morning to the warm, amber glow of the afternoon, marking the passage of hours that feel like mere minutes, or perhaps seconds that feel like hours. The shadows of the bamboo leaves outside dance against the shoji, creating a moving ink painting that is constantly being erased and redrawn by the wind. A cinema of nature played out on a paper screen. The host moves with a fluidity that is almost hypnotic, adding more charcoal to the fire. The smell of the sandalwood incense mixing with the earthy scent of the tea to create an aroma that calms the nervous system. Every object in the room has a story, a lineage. The bamboo scoop might have been carved by a famous master a century ago, given a poetic name like late autumn rain or morning frost, and the samurai listens intently as the host explains its provenance, visualizing the history held within the sliver of wood. This appreciation of the old, the worn, and the storied connects the warrior to the generations that came before him, not through blood and battle, but through the shared love of beauty in quiet places. The tension that usually resides in his shoulders, the perpetual readiness to draw a blade, has completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, resonant calm that settles in the marrow of his bones. Heavier than lead but lighter than air. He watches the steam rise from the kettle, swirling in the shaft of light, and sees in its chaotic, drifting patterns a mirror of the human mind, constantly moving, yet ultimately insubstantial and easily dispersed. The tea ceremony is a training of the spirit, a way to polish the soul until it is as clear and reflective as the water in the stone basin outside. It teaches the samurai that true strength is not found in the conquering of others, but in the conquering of one's own impatience, in the ability to sit still in a small room and find an entire universe within a bowl of green foam. As the ceremony draws to a close, the host cleans the utensils one by one, a ritual of closure that is as precise as the opening, wiping away the traces of the tea but leaving the memory of it intact. The ladle is rinsed, the whisk is inspected, the tea caddy is wiped, and each object is placed back in its designated spot, restoring the room to its original state of emptiness, as if nothing had happened at all. The samurai watches this final act with a sense of reluctance, wishing to remain in this sanctuary of shadows a little longer, to hold onto this feeling of weightlessness before returning to the gravity of the world. But the way of tea is also about the return, about carrying the stillness found in the tea room back out into the chaotic world like a hidden gem. He bows deeply to the host, to the other guests, and to the room itself, acknowledging the sanctuary it provided. Picking up his fan, he prepares to crawl back out through the small door, the nijiriguchi, back into the world of swords and duties. But he is not the same man who crawled in. He carries now a reservoir of silence within him, a cool, green lake of tranquility that he can draw upon when the heat of the world becomes too much to bear. knowing that the peace of the tea room is always there, waiting for him behind the paper screens, a quiet fortress that no enemy can ever breach. Leaving the dim, enclosed intimacy of the tea house, the samurai steps out onto the wooden veranda known as the Engawa, feeling the smooth, weathered cedar planks beneath his feet, which have been polished by generations of walking to a soft, satin-like sheen. Before him lies a landscape that is at once stark and infinitely complex, a dry landscape garden, or kairsensui, a masterpiece of minimalism where nature has been stripped down to its barest bones, rock, gravel, and moss. There are no flowering trees here to mark the seasons with riots of color, no streams of water to babble and distract the ear. Instead, there is a profound, monochromatic stillness, a scene composed entirely of shades of gray, white, and deep, ancient green. The garden is enclosed by a low earthen wall, stained with age and capped with roof tiles, which serves not to confine the view but to frame it, cutting off the chaotic details of the outside world and forcing the eye to settle on the composition within. The samurai sits down on the edge of the veranda, crossing his legs, and lets his gaze drift out over the sea of white gravel that has been raked into perfect, undulating patterns. These lines in the gravel are not random. They are waves, frozen in stone, capturing the energy of a rolling ocean or the swirling of clouds around a mountain peak. Yet they possess a solidity that water and air can never have. The gravel is blindingly white in the sunlight, reflecting a diffuse glow that seems to illuminate the garden from the ground up, creating a surreal, ethereal atmosphere where gravity feels suspended. Scattered across this white ocean are islands of dark, rugged rock, arranged in groups that feel accidental yet are mathematically precise, placed by masters who understood the balance of the universe. Some rocks stand tall and jagged, thrusting upwards like defiant mountains, while others lie low and flat, like tortoises resting on a beach. The samurai fixes his eyes on the largest stone, observing its texture, the way the lichen clings to its northern face in patches of dusty yellow and pale green. A slow-growing map of time that takes centuries to spread just a few inches. This rock has sat in this exact spot for 100 years, unmoved by storms, wars, or the changing of shoguns, and in its immobility, the warrior finds a reflection of the strength he seeks, not the active strength of the sword stroke, but the passive, enduring strength of the mountain. He breathes in slowly, the air crisp and dry, smelling faintly of the clay wall and the pine trees that peek over the top of the enclosure. The silence here is different from the silence of the tea room. It is an expansive, open silence, vast enough to swallow his thoughts whole. He imagines himself shrinking down, becoming small enough to walk among the gravel waves, wandering through the valleys of stone, a lone traveler in a petrified world. The act of viewing the garden is not passive. It is an act of co-creation, for the garden is designed to be a mirror of the mind. If his mind is turbulent, the rocks look jagged and hostile. If his mind is calm, they appear as comforting sentinels of peace. Today, as the peace of the era settles deeper into his bones, the rocks seem to float, heavy as they are, suspended in the white void of the gravel. He watches a single leaf fall from a maple tree outside the wall, drifting slowly down to land on the pristine ridges of the raked sand. In a perfect world, a monk would come to sweep it away, but for now it sits there, a singular imperfection that highlights the perfection of the whole. A splash of russet red against the endless white. The samurai contemplates the labor required to maintain this stillness. Every morning before the sun rises, the monks rake the gravel, pulling heavy wooden rakes through the stones to create these seamless lines. It is a grueling, repetitive task, a physical meditation that clears the mind by exhausting the body. He imagines the sound of the rake, crunch, 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 a rhythmic grinding that aligns the breath with the movement. This garden is a testament to the power of routine, of doing the same thing over and over until the doer disappears and only the deed remains. He closes his eyes for a moment, and the afterimage of the rocks burns behind his eyelids, a constellation of dark shapes in a white void. The lack of water in the garden is its greatest paradox. By removing the water, the designer has forced the viewer to imagine it, to see the ocean in the dry stone, and in doing so, the mind becomes the source of the water, flowing freely through the static landscape. It is a dry waterfall, a frozen river, a petrified sea, all existing simultaneously in a space no larger than a courtyard. The samurai feels the tension in his jaw release, the tightness in his chest unwind. In the battlefield, he was trained to look for movement, the flash of a blade, the shift of a horse's weight. But here, he is trained to look for stillness, to find the beauty in what does not change. The moss that grows around the base of the rocks is thick and velvety, a deep, emerald green that speaks of moisture and shade, softening the hard transition between the stone and the gravel. He imagines running his hand over it, feeling the cool, damp softness, a stark contrast to the sharp, dry edges of the granite. The garden demands nothing of him. It does not ask him to fight, to rule, or to decide. It simply asks him to be, to witness, to exist in the same space as the stones. The shadows of the rocks stretch long across the gravel as the afternoon wears on, turning the white waves into valleys of blue and gray, adding depth and mystery to the scene. The visual silence is so profound that it seems to have a sound of its own, a low, resonant hum that vibrates in the center of his being. He realizes that this garden is a fortress of the mind, a place where the chaos of the world cannot enter, where the only war is the struggle to keep one's attention from wandering. It is a training ground for the soul, teaching him that the true nature of reality is emptiness, not a bleak emptiness, but a fertile, pregnant void from which all things arise. The samurai sits, a statue of flesh mirroring the statues of stone, and in the shared stillness, the barrier between man and mineral begins to dissolve, leaving only the act of seeing. Pure and uncluttered. He is no longer a warrior of the Edo period. He is simply a consciousness floating in a sea of white stone, anchored by the heavy, silent rocks of eternity. As the samurai continues to sit, the passage of time becomes visible not through the movement of hands on a clock, for there are none here, but through the microscopic shifting of the shadows that cling to the base of the rocks, stretching out like dark pools of ink across the white paper of the gravel. He turns his attention to the wall that encloses the garden, the Tsuiji-be, a structure made of boiled oil and mud, topped with dark gray roof tiles that curve gently like the back of a sleeping dragon. The wall itself is a landscape of age, its surface stained with the patina of decades of rain and sun, creating abstract patterns of brown and ochre that are as mesmerizing as the rocks themselves. This wall is crucial, for it acts as a filter, screening out the bustling reality of the town, the shouts of merchants and the barking of dogs, allowing only the tops of the distant green mountains to peek over the edge, a technique known as shake, or borrowed scenery. By capturing the distant mountains and visually incorporating them into the small garden, the designer has collapsed the distance between near and far, creating an illusion of infinite space within a confined courtyard. The samurai contemplates this trick of the eye, realizing it is a metaphor for his own life. He is confined by his duties and his station, yet through his mind, he can borrow the vastness of the universe and bring it inside his own heart. The air in the garden begins to cool as the afternoon wanes, a subtle shift in temperature that brushes against his cheek like a ghost, carrying with it the scent of damp earth rising from the moss. He notices a small patch of moss growing on the north side of the central stone, a tiny, velvety forest of intense green that seems to glow with an inner light. He imagines himself shrinking down even further, walking among the stalks of moss as if they were towering cedar trees. Lost in a miniature world that exists unnoticed by the giants who walk the earth. This shift in perspective is a hallmark of the Zen mind, the ability to see the macrocosm in the microcosm, to find the entire world in a grain of sand. The gravel, raked into concentric circles around the rocks, mimics the ripples of water striking a shore, yet there is no sound of splashing, only the visual echo of a wave that never breaks. The lines are perfect, unbroken, a testament to the steady hand of the monk who raked them at dawn, walking backward, erasing his own footprints as he created the pattern, leaving behind a world where man has no presence. The samurai finds a deep comfort in this absence of footprints, this pristine, untouched quality that suggests a realm of pure spirit. His legs, folded beneath him for hours, have gone numb, but he does not move to relieve the discomfort. Instead, he accepts the sensation as just another texture of the moment, a physical anchor that keeps him tethered to the earth, while his mind floats in the white void. A dragonfly, iridescent and buzzing with a low, electric hum, darts into the garden, hovering for a moment above a stone like a suspended jewel, its wings blurring into invisibility, before darting away again, the only fast-moving thing in a world of slow geology. The contrast makes the stillness seem even heavier, a weight that presses down on the shoulders, relaxing the muscles, forcing the breath to deepen and slow until it matches the rhythm of the wind in the pines. The concept of Ma, the negative space, becomes tangible here. It is not just the rocks that matter, but the empty space between them, the white void that gives the rocks their definition. In the samurai's former life, space was something to be crossed, to be conquered, to be filled with arrows and men. But here, space is something to be honored, a fertile emptiness that is full of potential. He realizes that his life of peace is not an empty life, but a life full of Ma, a spaciousness that allows for thought, for art, and for being. The light continues to change, the sun dipping lower, casting the garden in a warm, golden hue that makes the white gravel shimmer like crushed pearls. The shadows of the rocks grow longer, reaching out to touch one another, connecting the isolated islands in a web of darkness. The samurai watches this slow transformation with the patience of a stone, his breathing almost imperceptible, his eyes half closed. He thinks of the geological time it took for these rocks to form, the millions of years of pressure and heat deep within the earth, the slow erosion by wind and water that shaped them into these specific forms, and finally, the arduous journey they took to arrive in this garden, carried by ox carts and positioned with millimeter precision by sweating laborers. All that history, all that energy, is now resting in total stillness, just as his own history of violence and struggle is now resting in the quiet of his chest. The garden is a graveyard of commotion, a place where all the noise of the universe comes to die and be reborn as silence. He feels a sense of profound gratitude for the wall that protects this silence, for the gravel that reflects the light, and for the rocks that anchor the world. The stillness is not empty. It is a heavy, thick substance that fills the lungs and slows the heart. It is a silence that has a texture like velvet, like deep water, wrapping around him, insulating him from the passage of time. He is no longer waiting for anything. He is no longer preparing for battle. He is simply here, a witness to the slow, beautiful endurance of stone. Finding in the rock garden a mirror for the unshakable peace he has finally constructed within himself. The code of Bushido, often romanticized in the songs of minstrels and the annals of history, as a rigid set of instructions for dying with honor on the blood-soaked battlefield, underwent a profound and silent metamorphosis as the fires of the Sengoku period turned to ash, and the cool, steady wind of the Edo peace began to blow across the islands of Japan. In this new era, where the clash of steel was replaced by the rustle of silk and the scratch of the brush, the way of the warrior did not vanish. Rather, it retreated inward, moving from the muscle to the marrow, from the act of killing to the art of living. Imagine a sword that is never drawn, its blade resting in the scabbard for decades, yet it remains polished, sharp, and ready every single day. This became the metaphor for the samurai's soul in peacetime. The code shifted its gravitational center from martial prowess to moral integrity, influenced heavily by the influx of Neo-Confucian philosophy that preached order, hierarchy, and the cultivation of virtue. The enemy was no longer a soldier in different colored armor charging across a field, but the internal demons of laziness, arrogance, greed, and emotional instability. To follow Bushido in a time of peace was to wage a constant, invisible war against one's own imperfections. A battle fought in the silence of the mind, while sitting in the administrative halls or walking the quiet streets of the castle town. The concept of jiri, or duty, expanded beyond the simple obligation to fight for one's lord to include the complex, burdensome duty of being a moral exemplar for the rest of society. The samurai had to be the living embodiment of discipline, a statue of stoicism that the common people could look up to as a stabilizing force. This meant that every action, no matter how trivial, was governed by a strict code of conduct. The way one walked, the way one bowed, the way one spoke, everything had to be measured, controlled, and dignified. There was no room for casual looseness. To relax one's posture was to relax one's spirit, and to relax the spirit was to invite chaos. This constant state of self-regulation created a unique kind of tension, a vibrating stillness that surrounded the samurai like a force field. They walked with a measured pace, neither too fast nor too slow, their eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing everything but reacting to nothing. The violence that was once their trade was now sublimated into a terrifyingly polite formality. If an insult was offered, the response was not an immediate strike, but a cold, impenetrable silence, a mastery of the temper that proved one's strength far more than a brawl ever could. The philosophy of Bunbu Ryodo, the dual way of the pen and the sword, became the guiding star, teaching that a true warrior must be as literate as he is lethal, that the study of history, poetry, and philosophy was necessary to temper the savage energy of the martial arts. The sword was kept at the hip not to take life, but to cut through delusions, to sever the attachments that clouded judgment. The samurai learned that the ultimate victory was the victory over oneself, Katsujinken, the life-giving sword, which protects rather than destroys. In this quiet age, loyalty to the Lord was expressed not by dying in a suicidal charge, but by living a long, tedious life of service, by balancing the books, by managing the floods, by advising with wisdom and honesty, even when the truth was unwelcome. This was a harder path in many ways, for it required a sustained endurance, a courage that had to be renewed every morning when the sun rose over a peaceful land. The adrenaline of combat was gone, replaced by the slow, grinding pressure of expectation. To wake up every day and choose to be a warrior in a world that did not need warriors was an act of supreme will. They treated their domestic lives with the same seriousness as a military campaign. The household was the castle, the family members were the retainers, and the budget was the supply line. Every aspect of existence was ritualized, turning the mundane into the sacred. Even the act of breathing was governed by the code, deep, diaphragmatic breaths that kept the center of gravity low and the mind clear. The samurai became the guardians of tradition, the custodians of a rigid social structure that they believed was the only thing preventing the return of chaos. They bore the weight of their two swords, the daisho, not as weapons of opportunity, but as heavy reminders of their responsibility to the past and the future. The silence of the samurai in peacetime was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a dam holding back a massive reservoir of water. It was a potent, heavy, active silence. They studied the ancient texts to understand the nature of loyalty, reading stories of warriors who had gutted themselves for their lords, and transposed that extreme devotion into the context of bureaucracy. "I will not die for my lord today," the peacetime samurai would think, "but I will ensure that his rice is counted correctly, that his peasants are fed, and that his name is honored. And I will do it with the same intensity as if I were storming a fortress." This was the internal transmutation of Bushido, a turning of the heat inwards until it crystallized the character into something hard, transparent, and unyielding. The fear of death, which the warrior was trained to overcome, was replaced by the fear of shame, Haji. To live with shame was considered a fate worse than death, and so the samurai navigated the complex social waters of the Edo period with a paranoid carefulness, terrified of a slip of the tongue or a breach of etiquette that would stain their family name. This hypersensitivity to honor created a society of immense politeness and profound repression, where the surface was always calm, like a polished mirror. But the depths were filled with the currents of unexpressed emotion. The code demanded that they show no pain, no hunger, no sorrow. They were to be the stoic fathers of the nation, absorbing the hardships of the era without a grimace. And so they stood in the rain, they sat in the cold offices, they walked the lonely roads, carrying the heavy, invisible armor of their code, protecting a peace that rendered them obsolete, finding meaning in the very act of endurance, proving that the strongest sword is the one that remains in the sheath. And the bravest warrior is the one who conquers the silence of his own heart. This conquest was not a singular event achieved on a distant morning of enlightenment, but a perpetual, rhythmic labor that required the samurai to polish his spirit just as he polished the steel of his blade, using the whetstone of daily routine to remove the rust of complacency. The code of Bushido in this era became a philosophy of absolute presence, a state known as zanshin, or lingering mind, which meant retaining a heightened state of awareness even after an action was completed. In war, this meant staying alert after striking an enemy in case he rose again. In peace, it meant placing a teacup down with total attention, ensuring that the hand did not retreat until the cup was perfectly stable, or closing a sliding door without allowing it to slam, guiding it into the latch with a silent, deliberate grace. This practice turned every moment of domestic life into a martial art, erasing the line between the dojo and the living room. The samurai moved through his house not as a casual inhabitant, but as a guardian of space, his movements economical and precise, wasting no energy on fidgeting or unnecessary gestures. To watch a samurai of the Edo period perform a simple task, like writing a letter or arranging flowers, was to witness a display of immense, contained power, a demonstration that the mind was fully inhabited, not wandering in the past or the future. The fear of death, which had once been a sharp, adrenaline-fueled terror, softened into a melancholic acceptance, a concept known as mono no aware, the pathos of things. They looked at the cherry blossoms falling in the spring wind and saw their own lives reflected there, beautiful, brief, and destined to fall. This awareness of mortality did not lead to despair, but to a profound appreciation of the present moment. Since death could come at any time, even in peace, perhaps from illness, perhaps from a sudden order to commit seppuku for a mistake made by a superior, every sunrise was a gift, and every bowl of rice was to be savored. The code taught them to live as if they were already dead, a psychological trick that liberated them from the anxiety of self-preservation. If one is already a ghost, one has nothing to lose, and therefore one can speak the truth and do what is right without hesitation. This ghostly detachment gave them an air of cool, unshakable dignity. They educated their sons in this rigorous school of thought, passing down the code to a generation that had never seen a battlefield. In the dim light of the family altar, fathers would tell their sons stories of the ancestors, not to glorify the bloodshed, but to emphasize the loyalty and the sacrifice. The young boys were taught to endure cold without shivering, to endure hunger without complaining, and to sit in silence for hours, learning that the mastery of the body was the first step to the mastery of the world. The education was severe, often involving waking up before dawn to practice calligraphy with freezing fingers, or to recite the Confucian classics until the throat was dry. But it was an education in fortitude. The father loved the son not with hugs and soft words, but with the fierce, demanding love of a craftsman shaping a piece of iron, wanting to ensure that the metal would not break when tested. The code also governed the samurai's relationship with his wife and daughters, a relationship defined by a complex web of duty and respect. The home was the woman's domain, and the samurai respected her authority there, understanding that while he guarded the gate, she guarded the hearth. There was a mutual, silent understanding of roles, a harmony built on the suppression of ego for the greater good of the ai, the household lineage. In the quiet evenings, the samurai might practice the shakuhachi, a bamboo flute, blowing long, mournful notes that sounded like the wind moving through a bamboo grove. This music was not for entertainment, but for suizen, blowing zen, a form of meditation that used the breath to clear the mind. The sound of the flute would drift over the walls of the compound, joining the sounds of the crickets and the rustling leaves, a sonic testament to the warrior's solitude. The code of Bushido effectively became a religion without a god, a system of ethics that provided a framework for every hour of the day. It answered the question of how to live when the primary purpose of one's existence, war, had been removed. The answer was to turn life itself into a battleground, where the enemies were sloth, dishonesty, and weakness. The samurai walked the streets with two swords, but his true weapon was his character, his ability to remain calm in the face of provocation, to remain upright in the face of corruption, and to remain loyal in a world that was constantly changing. The peace of the Edo period was not a natural phenomenon. It was a constructed reality, held together by the collective will of the samurai class to adhere to this code. They were the steel skeleton of the nation, rigid and unbending, allowing the flesh of the economy and the culture to grow around them. Even as the merchants grew richer and the townspeople grew more boisterous, the samurai remained apart, islands of silence in a rising sea of noise, holding fast to the ancient ways. They understood that their privileges, the right to wear swords, the right to cut down a commoner who insulted them, though rarely exercised, came with the crushing burden of expectation. They were watched by everyone, by the peasants in the fields, by the merchants in the shops, by their own families, and most importantly, by the spirits of their ancestors. There was no private moment for a samurai. Even in sleep, he was expected to lie in a posture of readiness. This relentless pressure forged a specific type of human being, one who was inwardly tense but outwardly placid, a man who carried a universe of discipline behind a mask of indifference. The code was a heavy cloak, stifling at times, but it offered the comfort of certainty. In a world of floating weeds, the samurai was a rock, anchored by the gravity of his duty. As the decades of peace stretched into centuries, the armor in the alcove may have gathered dust, but the code in the heart remained burnished and bright, a silent, internal flame that guided them through the long, quiet twilight of their era, proving that the hardest war to fight is the one that never ends. The war to remain true to oneself in a world that invites compromise. In the profound silence that descended upon Japan during the long Edo peace, the samurai found that the sharpest edge they possessed was no longer the tempered steel of their katana, but the precise, cutting insight of their own minds, a clarity that they began to distill into the 17 syllables of the haiku. This art form, brief as a single breath and deep as the ocean, became the vessel for their warrior spirit, transforming the observation of death and life into a celebration of the fleeting moment. Imagine the warrior sitting on the veranda of his home, the sliding doors open to reveal the garden where the first snow of winter is beginning to fall, dusting the pine needles with white powder. He holds a brush, the tip inked with black soot, hovering over a strip of mulberry paper, his mind emptying of all strategy, all politics, all history, until there is nothing left but the snow, the silence, and the beat of his own heart. The discipline required to write a haiku is identical to the discipline of the sword. It requires zanshin, total awareness, and the ability to strike at the essence of reality without hesitation. There is no room for excess in a haiku, just as there is no room for wasted movement in a duel. Every syllable must carry the weight of existence. They wrote of the sound of a frog jumping into an old pond, plop, breaking the ancient silence. They wrote of the cicada's shell, empty and dry, singing of a life that has already moved on. They wrote of the moon hanging over a battlefield, where the grass has long since covered the bones of the fallen. This poetry was not an escape from their reality, but a way to confront it, to look straight into the face of impermanence, mujo, and find it beautiful. The samurai learned to see the world with a haiku eye, a vision that zooms in on the smallest details, a dewdrop on a lotus leaf, a spider weaving its web in the corner of a shrine, the smell of rain on hot dust, and in those details, they found a peace that the grand narratives of war could never provide. The poem became a snapshot of eternity, a way to freeze time in a world that was constantly changing. As the ink dried on the paper, the samurai felt a release, a letting go of the ego, realizing that he was just another part of this vast, breathing nature, no more significant than the cricket chirping in the grass. But while many samurai found solace within the walls of their estates and the structure of their stipends, there was another class of warrior for whom peace brought a different, quieter struggle. A struggle not of ink and paper, but of survival and identity on the lonely roads of the countryside. These were the ronin, the wave men, samurai who had lost their masters through death, disgrace, or the dissolution of their clans, and who now found themselves drifting like leaves on a stream, untethered and alone in a stratified society. The silence of the ronin was the silence of the outsider, the man who stands on the edge of the village looking in, his clothes worn and faded, his swords the only shiny things he owns. For the ronin, the peace of the Edo period was a double-edged sword. It meant safety from death in battle, but it also meant a slow, grinding poverty and a loss of place in the world. Yet in this dispossession, many ronin found a profound and unexpected freedom, a liberation from the rigid protocols of the court and the stifling expectations of duty. They walked the highways, the great Takado Road, their faces hidden under deep, basket-like straw hats called tengai, seeing the world not from the high horse of a conqueror, but from the muddy sandals of a traveler. The struggle of the ronin was internal and quiet. It was the struggle to maintain dignity when the stomach was empty, to uphold the code of Bushido when there was no lord to witness it. They became the ultimate stoics, enduring the biting wind of winter and the scorching heat of summer with a grim acceptance, sleeping in ruined temples or under the eaves of sympathetic farmers. Many of them turned their swords into plowshares, quite literally, laying down their weapons to pick up the hoe and the spade, integrating themselves into peasant villages, where they worked the land with the same intensity they had once trained for war. Imagine a man with the calloused hands of a swordsman now planting rice seedlings in the flooded paddies, his back bent under the sun, finding a rhythm in the cycle of the harvest that made more sense to him than the cycle of vengeance. The mud of the field felt honest and real. It did not lie, it did not betray, it simply yielded life in return for labor. In these quiet villages, the Ronin often became the guardians of the community, not as overlords, but as silent protectors who would stand between the farmers and the bandits, or between the village and a corrupt tax collector. They became teachers, opening small schools, terracotta in rural temples, teaching the children of farmers how to read and write, passing on the classics of Confucianism and the art of calligraphy to a generation that would never hold a weapon. In the eyes of these children, the Ronin saw a future that was innocent of blood, and in teaching them, the warrior found a new purpose, a way to shape the future not by cutting it down, but by watering it like a garden. The Ronin struggle was also a spiritual journey. Stripped of their rank and their stipend, they were forced to ask the ultimate question: who am I when I am no longer a samurai? The answer often came in the long, silent hours of meditation, sitting on a flat rock by a mountain stream, realizing that their worth was not defined by a crest or a paycheck, but by the content of their character. They became the Kamuso, the monks of nothingness, playing the bamboo flute with a basket over their head to suppress their ego, wandering from door to door asking for alms, not out of begging, but as a practice of humility. The sound of their flute was the sound of their struggle, a lonely, haunting melody that drifted through the mist of the valleys, telling the story of a class of men who had been left behind by history, but who had found a way to walk their own path. This was a quiet heroism, unrecorded in the official histories, a heroism of endurance, of finding peace in the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The Ronin learned to look at the moon not as a poet from a balcony, but as a companion on a cold night, a silent friend who watched over their solitary sleep. Their lives were hard, stripped of luxury, but in that hardness there was a diamond-like clarity. They were free to follow the wind, free to follow their conscience, and free to find their own definition of honor in a world that had tried to discard them. Thus, the Ronin's quiet struggle was not a tragedy, but a transformation, a shedding of the armor to reveal the man underneath, a man who had learned that true strength does not need a master, for he is the master of his own soul. This mastery was not claimed with a shout, but discovered in the whisper of the wind, through the cedar trees that lined the mountain passes. A wind that seemed to speak the same language as the Ronin's solitude. As he walked, the straw of his sandals, the wareji, would slowly wear down against the stones of the path, a physical reminder of the journey that consumes the traveler, and in this wearing down, there was a lesson of surrender. He would often stop at the small, moss-covered roadside shrines dedicated to Jizo, the guardian of travelers and children, and pour a ladle of water over the stone statue, watching the liquid darken the gray rock before evaporating in the sun, an act of silent prayer for all those who wander without a home. The Ronin carried his entire life on his back, a spare robe, a flint for fire, a bowl for rice, and his writing kit, and this lack of possessions made him light, allowing him to move through the world like a shadow, unburdened by the heavy furniture of status. When the rain began to fall, drumming softly on the wide brim of his straw hat, he did not curse the weather but accepted it as a companion, seeking shelter in a dilapidated wayside hut or under the eaves of a closed tea shop. There, sitting on the damp earth while the rain created a curtain of silver beads before him, the urge to compose poetry would rise again, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a way to capture the melancholic beauty of the moment. He would take out his brush and inkstone, using rain water to grind the ink, and write a haiku on a scrap of paper or sometimes, if he had no paper, he would simply compose the poem in his mind, letting it dissolve into the air like the mist, a gift to the universe that required no reader. He wrote of the coldness of the stone floor, the warmth of a distant fire he could not reach, the sound of a crow calling into the twilight, finding that the poverty of his circumstances enriched the depth of his perception. The Ronin saw things that the high-ranking samurai in the castle never saw. He saw the way the farmers laughed in the mud while planting rice. He saw the intricate spider webs glistening in the morning dew on a forgotten fence. He saw the struggle of the common people and realized it was noble. This connection to the earth grounded him, stripping away the arrogance of his warrior caste until he was simply a man standing between heaven and earth. In the evenings, if he stayed at a village inn, he might trade a story of the old wars for a bowl of miso soup and a bed of straw. His voice low and rumbling, as he spun tales of glory that now seemed like dreams from another life. The villagers would listen with wide eyes, seeing the scarred hands of the storyteller and sensing the dangerous history that lay dormant within him. Yet they felt safe, for the Ronin's violence had been tamed by the road. Sometimes he would stay in a village for a season, helping to repair a bridge or harvest the wheat. His physical strength, once used to cleave bone, now used to build and sustain. He became a part of the landscape, a figure in a faded indigo kimono who was always there in the background, watching, protecting, existing. The struggle was the silence of the nights when the memories of fallen comrades would return, ghosts of the battlefield asking him why he survived, and the only answer he could give was to breathe. To inhale the cool night air and exhale the past, anchoring himself in the present moment. He learned to mend his own clothes, the needle moving in and out of the fabric with the same precision as a dagger, stitching together the fragments of his dignity. He learned to cook simple meals over a fire of fallen twigs, finding a profound satisfaction in the taste of rice he had boiled himself, a flavor of independence that was sweeter than any banquet served by a lord. The sword at his hip, the katana, was no longer a tool of ambition, but a symbol of his soul's alignment. He kept it clean and oiled not because he expected to fight, but because respect for the blade was respect for himself. On clear autumn nights, he would sit under the vast, star-filled sky, the Milky Way stretching above him like a river of white dust. And he would feel a sense of unity with the cosmos that transcended all human hierarchy. He realized that the shogun in his castle and the ronin on the road were both sleeping under the same stars, both subject to the same laws of nature, both destined to return to the dust. This realization was the ultimate liberation, the point where the struggle ceased to be a struggle and became a way of being. The ronin walked the path of the clouds and water, unsui, drifting freely without attachment, his mind fluid and adaptable. He observed the changing of the seasons with the intimacy of a lover. The first bud of the plum blossom in February was a promise of survival. The intense buzzing of the cicadas in August was a chant of vitality. The red maples of November were a burning farewell, and the silence of the winter snow was a blanket of rest. In this cycle, he found his rhythm, a slow, deliberate cadence that carried him through the years. He might pass a group of samurai traveling in a procession, shouting for commoners to bow, and he would step aside into the tall grass, bowing his head not out of fear but out of a deep, secret understanding that he was free from the chains they still wore. He had no reputation to defend, no rank to climb, no master to please. He had only the road, the sky, and the poem forming in his heart. The pen and the sword had merged in him. His life was the poem, and his endurance was the blade. As he aged, his steps became slower but more sure, his face weathered like an old cliffside, his eyes holding the calm depth of a mountain lake. He had become a philosopher of the roadside, a sage of the rice paddies, proving that nobility was not a matter of birth, but of spirit. The silence of the Ronin was the silence of the deep woods, a silence that was full of life, full of history, and full of peace, a quiet struggle that had resolved itself into a quiet victory, leaving behind no monuments of stone, but a legacy of haiku scattered on the wind, whispering of a beauty that can only be found when one has lost everything else and found oneself. As the crimson sun began to dip below the tiled rooftops of the sprawling city of Edo, casting long, purple shadows across the wooden bridges and the dusty thoroughfares, a transformation took place within the ranks of the samurai, a shift from the role of the warrior who conquers to the role of the guardian who preserves. The chaotic energy of the Warring States period had been distilled into the rigid, grid-like structure of the castle towns. And the men who once rode horses into the fray now walked the beat of the city streets, their presence serving as the living, breathing architecture of civil order. Imagine the sound of the heavy wooden gates of the city districts slowly creaking, shut as the temple bells tolled the hour of dusk, sealing the neighborhoods into safe, manageable pockets of quietude. Into this deepening twilight stepped the samurai of the city patrol, the machikata, clad not in the heavy armor of the battlefield, but in the dark, practical kimonos of their office, often wearing a distinct haori jacket that marked them as officers of the peace. They carried with them a different kind of weapon, often leaving the long katana at home or tied securely to their waist, favoring instead the jit, a specialized iron truncheon with a hook on the side, designed not to kill but to disarm, to capture, and to subdue without spilling blood. This shift from the lethality of the blade to the non-lethal authority of the iron rod was the physical manifestation of the era's philosophy, that a true peace is maintained by controlling violence, not by unleashing it. As they walked the narrow, winding streets, their sandals clapping rhythmically against the hard-packed earth, they carried paper lanterns painted with the crest of their magistrate, the soft, flickering candlelight creating a moving bubble of visibility in the darkness. The city of Edo was a labyrinth of wood and paper, a sleeping giant that required constant vigilance, and the samurai were its eyes and ears. They walked with a slow, deliberate gait, a pace that projected an aura of unshakable calm, their eyes scanning the shadows of the alleys, the shuttered fronts of the merchant shops, and the quiet canals where boats bobbed gently on the black water. They were listening for the discordant sounds of trouble, a raised voice in a tavern, the splintering of wood, the sudden cry of a thief. But mostly, they heard only the sounds of a city at rest. The crying of a baby, the murmur of a family eating dinner, the chirping of crickets in the small courtyard gardens. This was the boring duty of peace, a repetitive, endless loop of patrolling the same streets night after night. Yet in this repetition, they found a deep sense of purpose. They were the Daishin and the Yoriki, the low-ranking samurai who formed the police force, and they took immense pride in their ability to read the city like a book. They knew the faces of the shopkeepers, the habits of the artisans, and the secrets of the tea houses. Their authority was absolute but rarely exercised with force, often. The mere sight of the magistrate's lantern bobbing down the street was enough to send potential troublemakers scattering into the shadows. They stood guard at the wooden gates that separated the wards, checking the travel permits of those who wished to pass at night, examining the papers with a meticulous slowness that was designed to intimidate and to ensure total compliance. "Who goes there?" they would ask, their voices low and gravelly, not shouting but commanding the silence. This was a war against disorder, a battle fought with paperwork, patrols, and presence. The greatest enemy of the wooden city was not a foreign army, but fire, the flower of Edo, and the samurai transformed themselves into the leaders of the fire brigades, bringing military discipline to the chaos of a conflagration. High above the city, on tall wooden watchtowers that swayed gently in the wind, samurai watchmen stood for hours, scanning the horizon for the telltale glow of orange against the black sky. When the alarm bell rang, clang, 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 it was the samurai who rushed to the scene, not to fight men, but to fight the elements, organizing the townspeople into bucket brigades, directing the demolition of buildings to create fire breaks, standing amidst the smoke and the sparks with the same stoic courage their ancestors had shown amidst arrows. They wore thick, quilted coats soaked in water to protect themselves from the heat, holding heavy standards to mark their positions, becoming anchors of calm in a sea of panic. When the fire was out, or when the night remained peaceful, they returned to their guard posts, the bancho, small wooden huts where they would sit by a charcoal brazier, warming their hands and drinking tea, waiting for the dawn. These guard posts were the nerve centers of the city, places of refuge where a lost child could be brought or a dispute could be mediated. The samurai acted as judges in the streets, resolving petty arguments between neighbors over property lines or noise, using their knowledge of Confucian ethics to broker compromises that saved face for everyone involved. They were the immune system of the body politic, constantly circulating, removing toxins, and ensuring the health of the whole. The silence of the night patrol was a heavy, protective blanket. The townspeople slept soundly knowing that the men with the two swords were out there, walking the darkness so that they could dream in light. The concept of aku or evil was no longer an abstract demon, but a breach of the social contract, and the samurai were the enforcers of that contract. They developed a network of informants, ears on the ground, turning the entire city into a web of surveillance where nothing went unnoticed. This was not a tyranny of fear, but a tyranny of order, a structure so tight and so well maintained that crime became difficult to commit. The samurai's face, illuminated from below by the lantern light, was a mask of professional detachment. He was not an individual with personal feelings, but the embodiment of the law itself. He walked past the geisha districts, hearing the faint sounds of the shamisen and laughter, yet he did not enter, remaining on the threshold. The guardian of the boundary between the world of pleasure and the world of duty. He walked past the temples, bowing slightly to the statues of the Buddha, acknowledging the spiritual dimension of his service. His footsteps were the heartbeat of the city, a steady, rhythmic thumping that said, "All is well, all is safe." As the night deepened and the mist rolled in from the bay, dampening the sounds of the city even further, the samurai's vigil continued, a lonely, quiet struggle against the entropy of the world. He was the watchman who never slept, the sword that guarded the sheath of society, finding his glory not in the taking of heads, but in the preservation of the hush that lay over the sleeping capital. The vigilance of the samurai did not end with the rising of the sun. For as the first gray light of dawn began to wash out the stars, and the crows began their morning conversation from the temple roofs, the night patrol would slowly make their way back to the magistrate's office, their lanterns now extinguished, their shadows stretching long and thin against the waking walls of the city. The opening of the massive wooden gates known as the Kaido, which separated the various districts of Edo, was a ritual of heavy, grinding timber and clanking iron that signaled the beginning of the city's pulse. The samurai stood by as the gatekeepers removed the heavy crossbars, watching with a detached, sleepy gaze as the first wave of fishmongers and vegetable sellers rushed through with their baskets, their feet padding softly on the earth, eager to reach the markets. This transition from the silence of the night to the hum of the day brought a different kind of order to maintain, an order of commerce and flow rather than silence and shadows. During the day, the samurai's role shifted to that of an administrator of the streets, a bureaucrat of the pavement who ensured that the life of the city remained within the strict boundaries of the law. They would sit for hours in the bancho, the guard houses strategically placed at major intersections and bridge crossings, observing the endless stream of humanity with a practiced boredom that missed nothing. These guard posts were small islands of stillness in the river of people. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco smoke and old wood, and the samurai would sit cross-legged, perhaps cleaning the bowl of a pipe or meticulously sharpening a quill, radiating an aura of dormant authority. Their presence alone was often enough to regulate the speed of the street. People walked a little straighter, spoke a little softer, and bowed a little lower when passing the open front of the guard house. The samurai were the custodians of the Gon and Gyumi system, the 5 family groups of mutual responsibility, a web of social surveillance that bound neighbors together in a pact of self-policing. This meant that the samurai rarely had to chase down a criminal. The structure of the society, which they upheld like the pillars of a temple, did the work for them. If a crime was committed, the entire neighborhood was held accountable, and so the pressure to maintain order came from within the community itself, pressing down on every household like the heavy, humid air of the Tokyo summer. The samurai merely had to oversee this pressure, checking the registers, verifying the seals on travel documents, and listening to the whispered reports of the neighborhood heads. It was a job of listening, of gathering information, of knowing who had entered the city and who had left, a mental cataloging of souls that required a memory as sharp as a blade. They dealt with the mundane reality of urban life, lost property, runaway apprentices, disputes over the price of rice, treating each case with a slow, deliberate gravity that emphasized the weight of the shogunate. Imagine the scene of a samurai inspecting a cart loaded with bales of cotton. He moves around it slowly, tapping the bales with his jit, checking for hollow sounds, his face unreadable. While the merchant waits with bated breath, the seconds ticking by like hours. There is no hurry, for the law does not rush. The dust of the street settles on the samurai's dark kimono, blending him into the landscape of the city he protects. He is as much a part of the street as the willow trees that line the canals, a permanent, unmoving fixture around which the current of life flows. In the heat of the afternoon, when the cicadas buzz with a deafening intensity and the heat waves shimmer off the tiled roofs, the samurai remains at his post, fanning himself slowly with a paper fan, his discipline keeping him upright when others seek the shade. This endurance of the elements is a silent sermon to the people, a demonstration of the gammon, or perseverance, that is the hallmark of his class. He watches the boats drifting down the Sumida River, laden with sake barrels and timber, and sees not just goods, but the lifeblood of the peace he guards. The rivers and canals are the arteries of Edo, and the samurai are the valves that regulate the flow, ensuring that nothing moves without observation. They are also the guardians of the aesthetic order. They ensure that no one wears clothes above their station, that no merchant builds a house grander than a samurai's, enforcing the sumptuary laws that keep the visual hierarchy of the world intact. This policing of appearance is a subtle psychological warfare, a way of reminding everyone, with a glance or a word, of their place in the great chain of being. As the seasons change, so too do the duties of the guardian. In the typhoon season, they secure the shutters and watch the rising water levels of the moats. In the winter, they distribute rice from the government granaries to the poor, transforming from enforcers to benefactors, their harsh authority softening into paternal care. The silence of the samurai is the silence of the dam that holds back the flood, a passive, heavy force that allows the valley below to flourish. They do not seek gratitude, for they are doing their duty jiri, a concept as natural to them as breathing. They walk the thin line between the hard steel of the military and the soft paper of the civil administration, embodying the paradox of the Edo period. a warrior class that has made war on disorder itself. Even their weapons reflect this. The jit usually has no sharp edge. It is a bar of solid iron, representing the blunt, undeniable weight of the law rather than the sharp, cutting anger of the individual. As the day begins to fade and the shadows lengthen once more, the samurai prepares to hand over the watch to the night patrol, a changing of the guard that happens with the precision of a clock. He writes his final report in the daily logbook, the brush scratching softly against the paper, recording that on this day, nothing happened, and that nothing is his greatest victory. He has kept the peace for another rotation of the sun, holding the chaos at bay with his presence, his patience, and his silence. He steps out of the guard house, his shift ended, and walks back to his modest home, indistinguishable from the other shadows of the twilight. A silent guardian dissolving back into the quiet order he has devoted his life to maintaining. The ultimate battlefield for the samurai of the Great Peace was not found on the grassy plains of Sekigahara or amidst the burning fortifications of a besieged castle, but rather it was located within the silent, unseen geography of the human heart, a terrain far more treacherous and difficult to conquer than any physical province. As the external wars ceased and the armor was packed away into wooden chests to gather the dust of decades, the warrior turned his gaze inward, discovering that the cessation of violence in the streets did not automatically equate to peace in the mind. In fact, the absence of an external enemy revealed the presence of a far more persistent and formidable foe. The self, with all its restless desires, its fears of obsolescence, and its constant, chattering ego. Imagine a room in the deepest part of the samurai's residence. A space stripped of all decoration save for a single calligraphy scroll that reads mu, or nothingness, where the warrior sits in the center of the tatami mat. Legs folded into the full lotus position, hands forming the cosmic mudra in his lap, engaging in the practice of zazen, or seated meditation. This was the new arena of combat, a battle fought in absolute stillness, where the weapon was not a sword of steel, but the breath itself. The silence of the room is heavy, pressing in on the ears, amplifying the sound of the wind rattling the shoji screens and the rhythmic beating of the samurai's own heart, which sounds to him like a war drum in the void. He closes his eyes halfway, allowing his gaze to rest unfocused on the floor a few feet in front of him, and begins the arduous task of taming the wild horse of the mind. At first, the mind rebels against this inactivity. It screams for stimulation, for action, for the adrenaline that his ancestors lived by. Memories of past slights, worries about future stipends, and the phantom pains of old injuries all rise up like ghosts to distract him, clamoring for attention. The internal battle is the struggle to watch these thoughts arise without engaging them, to let them float by like clouds across a vast, empty sky, neither grasping at them nor pushing them away. It is a discipline of radical acceptance, a training to become the observer rather than the actor. The physical pain of sitting for hours without moving is intense. The knees ache, the back stiffens, and the legs go numb, sending pins and needles through the nerves. A lesser man would move, would shift his weight to relieve the suffering, but the samurai treats this pain as he would a wound in battle. He acknowledges it, he feels it, and then he transcends it, using the discomfort as an anchor to keep him tethered to the present moment. He breathes in deeply through the nose, drawing the air down into the tendon, the energy center just below the navel, and exhales slowly, imagining all his tension, all his anger, and all his ego leaving his body with the breath. This is the cultivation of Futishin, the immovable mind, a state of spiritual fortitude that cannot be disturbed by any external circumstance. In the dojo, he learned to parry a strike. Here on the cushion, he learns to parry the fear of death itself. The samurai realizes that his identity has been wrapped up in his function as a killer, and now that the killing has stopped, he must face the terrifying question of who he is when he is not destroying. The silence forces him to confront his own emptiness, the void at the center of his being. This is not a nihilistic emptiness, but a fertile one, a realization that the rigid self he thought he was, the name, the rank, the clan, is just a construct, a mask worn for society. Beneath the mask lies a boundless, quiet awareness that is connected to everything in the universe. This realization is frightening at first, like stepping off a cliff, but as he continues to sit, day after day, year after year, the fear transforms into a profound sense of liberation. He fights the battle against boredom, which is perhaps the deadliest enemy of all in peacetime. Boredom whispers that he is wasting his time, that he should be out drinking sake or practicing archery, but he stays on the mat, fighting the urge to flee the moment. He learns that boredom is just another layer of the ego resisting the present reality. As the incense burns down in the burner, measuring the passage of time with its falling ash, the samurai delves deeper into his own psyche, hunting down the shadows of pride and arrogance. He remembers the teachings of the Zen masters who say that the sword that saves is the sword that cuts the ego. He visualizes drawing this internal sword and slicing through his own attachments, his attachment to his reputation, his attachment to comfort, his attachment to being right. It is a suicide of the self, a ritual death that allows him to be reborn as a man of true peace. The sweat beads on his forehead not from heat, but from the intensity of the concentration. The mental exertion is as exhausting as swinging a heavy hammer. He realizes that true bravery is not charging into enemy lines, but sitting alone in a room and facing the darkness within oneself without blinking. The internal battle is a war of attrition. There is no final victory, no parade, no medal. There is only the practice, the endless returning to the breath, the constant polishing of the mirror of the mind. Sometimes, after hours of struggle, a moment of breakthrough occurs, a sudden clarity where the division between the sitter and the room dissolves, where the sound of the rain outside is not heard by him, but is him. In this state of muga, or no self, the burden of being a samurai lifts, and he feels a lightness that makes him want to weep. But he does not weep. He simply breathes, letting the feeling pass just as the pain passed. He understands now that the peace of the country depends on the peace of the individual. A man at war with himself will create war around him. But a man who has conquered his own heart can walk through a battlefield and remain untouched. This is the secret strategy of the era, the hidden fortification that protects the shogunate more effectively than stone walls. The internal battle is the forge where the raw iron of the warrior's spirit is hammered into the fine steel of the sage's wisdom. It is a lonely path, invisible to the world, but as he opens his eyes and prepares to stand up, his legs numb and his mind clear as a winter morning, he knows that he has fought the good fight. And in the silence of the room, he claims the only victory that truly matters, the conquest of his own restless soul. This internal conquest was not a singular event, but a continuous siege, a daily negotiation between the primal instincts of the blood and the refined requirements of the spirit. A conflict that often raged most fiercely in the quiet, unguarded moments of the day. As the samurai moved from the meditation cushion to the veranda, the battleground shifted from the void of the mind to the friction of daily existence, where the code of jiri or duty constantly clashed with the pull of ninjo or human emotion. This dichotomy was the invisible wound that every warrior carried, a tear in the fabric of the soul that required constant mending. Imagine the immense psychological weight of living in a society where every facial expression, every tone of voice, and every gesture was scrutinized for signs of weakness or rebellion. The samurai wore a mask of absolute composure, known as taitmi, the public face, which was polished and impenetrable like a porcelain doll. But behind this mask lay the Han, the true sound of his heart, which often screamed in frustration or wept in sorrow. The internal battle was the Herculean effort to keep the Han hidden, to swallow the anger when insulted by a corrupt official, to suppress the grief when a loved one died, to deny the fear when the future looked bleak. It was a form of emotional asceticism, a starving of the ego until it became too weak to protest. The energy required to maintain this facade was greater than the energy needed to swing a sword for a day. It was an isometric exercise of the will, pushing against the walls of one's own nature without ever moving a muscle. There were days when the beast within, the metaphorical oni or demon of violence that lived in the belly of every warrior, would wake up hungry, demanding to be fed with chaos. On these days, the samurai would feel the itch in his hands to draw the blade, to cut through the red tape, to solve his problems with the simple, brutal logic of steel. But he would fight this demon not with weapons, but with rituals. He would channel that destructive energy into the meticulous cleaning of his armor, scrubbing the lacquer plates until his arms burned, using the physical labor to exhaust the internal fire. Or he would turn to the practice of shodo, calligraphy, forcing his trembling hand to execute a perfect, fluid circle on the paper, entrusting his rage to the ink, letting it flow out of him and dry into a harmless black line. This was the sublimation of the warrior's spirit, the alchemical process of turning leaden anger into golden art. The silence of the house was often the loudest accuser. In the absence of war, there was no external noise to drown out the voice of conscience. The samurai would find himself interrogating his own motives. Am I truly loyal, or am I just afraid? Am I peaceful, or am I just tired? These questions circled in his mind like koi in a pond, never landing, never resolving. He battled against the feeling of obsolescence, the nagging suspicion that he was a relic of a bygone age, a beautifully decorated tool with no function. To combat this, he had to construct a new meaning for his life, one based on the unseen virtues of integrity and stewardship. He fought the battle of memory, wrestling with the ghosts of ancestors who seemed to look down from the family altar with judgment in their painted eyes. He had to make peace with the fact that he would never equal their martial glory, and that his bravery would have to be measured in patience rather than heads taken. This required a humility that was painful to swallow, a bowing down of the spirit to the reality of the times. The nights were often the hardest part of the campaign. Lying on his futon in the dark, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his family, the samurai's mind would wander into the borderlands of anxiety. Insomnia was a common adversary, a shadow that sat on his chest and refused to leave. In these sleepless hours, he would practice the contemplation of death, shinigurui, visualizing his own end in vivid detail, the funeral rites, the body turning to ash, the world continuing on without him. This morbid exercise was not meant to induce depression, but to induce a radical freedom. By accepting his death before it happened, by dying mentally every night, he freed himself from the fear of it during the day. He reasoned that if he was already dead, then the insults of the world could not hurt him, the poverty could not starve him, and the boredom could not weary him. He was a ghost walking through a dream, and this detachment was his shield. He fought against the temptation of nostalgia, the seductive pull to romanticize the bloody past of the Sengoku era. It was easy to dream of being a hero in a great war. It was much harder to be a decent man in a quiet peace. He reminded himself that the good old days were days of famine, fire, and slaughter, and that the boredom he felt now was a luxury purchased with the blood of his forefathers. He had to discipline his gratitude, forcing himself to see the blessing in the monotony. The internal battle also involved the taming of the senses. He trained himself to eat simple food without craving delicacies, to wear plain clothes without envying the silks of the merchants, to sit in the cold without seeking the fire. This voluntary hardship kept his spirit sharp, preventing the rot of luxury from setting in. He was a gardener of his own soul, constantly weeding out the desires that threatened to choke his virtue. The weed of envy was particularly persistent. Seeing the merchant class rise in wealth while his own stipend remained fixed was a bitter pill. He had to fight the internal war against resentment, reminding himself that his wealth was his honor, a currency that could not be devalued by the market. He sought the company of trees and stones, finding in their silent endurance a model for his own behavior. A pine tree twisting in the wind but not breaking became a teacher. A rock sitting in the river letting the water flow over it became a master. He internalized the landscape, turning his mind into a garden where the rocks of discipline stood firm against the chaotic waters of emotion. As he walked the streets of Edo, he was fighting 1,000 tiny battles with every step. The battle to keep his eyes forward, the battle to keep his spine straight, the battle to speak with kindness when he felt annoyance. No one saw these victories. There were no cheers, no rewards. But to the samurai, the feeling of a day passed in perfect self-control was a triumph as sweet as any victory on the battlefield. He was the commander of a fortress that was under constant siege from within, and his vigilance was the only thing keeping the walls from crumbling. It was a quiet, desperate, magnificent struggle, a war without end that defined the true nobility of the peacetime warrior. And so, we arrive at the final quietude, the ultimate destination of a journey that began with the fading echoes of battle and traveled through the long, winding paths of bureaucracy, art, and internal discipline, leading us to this single, solitary room where the light is fading into the deep indigo of evening. In the center of this room, resting upon the black lacquer stand known as the katana cake, lies the sword, the soul of the samurai, which has remained sheathed for a lifetime. The scabbard, or saya, is a masterpiece of craftsmanship, painted in a deep, glossy black that seems to hold the shadows of the room within its surface. Perhaps dusted with flecks of gold that catch the dying light like distant stars. It is not merely a container for the blade. It is a prison for the violence that once ruled the land, a seal that has been kept unbroken by the strength of the warrior's will. The samurai, now an old man with hair as white as the winter snow on Mount Fuji, sits before it, not in a posture of readiness, but in a posture of deep, reflective gratitude. He looks at the curve of the sheath, a gentle arc that mimics the horizon of the ocean, and he realizes that the greatest victory he ever achieved was not over a rival clansman, but over the temptation to draw this weapon. Every day for 50 years he has woken up, tied this heavy weight to his hip, and carried it through the streets, feeling its cold promise against his side, and every day for 50 years. He has chosen not to use it. This accumulation of non-action, this mountain of restrained impulses, is his true legacy. The silk cord, the seigyo, which ties the scabbard to the belt, is frayed slightly at the edges, worn soft by the touch of his hands, hands that learned to mix ink, to whisk tea, and to caress the rough bark of garden trees, hands that chose creation over destruction. The sword has become a symbol not of death, but of a peace that is heavy, substantial, and hard-won. He remembers the days of his youth, the fire that burned in his belly, the desperate need to prove himself, and he sees how that fire has been transformed into the warm, steady glow of the charcoal brazier that now heats the room. The silence of the sword is infectious. It spreads out from the alcove, filling the house, flowing out into the garden, and settling over the entire city of Edo. It is a silence that says the war is over, not just for the nation, but for the man. The blade inside the sheath is still sharp, preserved in a coat of clove oil, pristine and lethal, but it sleeps a deep, dreamless sleep, unaware of the changing world outside. It is a sleeping beauty that will never be woken, for the Prince of Peace has already arrived. The samurai reaches out and runs a finger along the smooth lacquer of the scabbard, feeling the coolness of the wood, a tactile connection to the history he carries. He thinks of the generations that will follow him, his grandchildren who are currently sleeping in the next room, children who have never seen a battle, who do not know the smell of blood, whose hands are soft and uncalloused. He has carried the burden of the sword, so that they might carry the lightness of the flute or the book. This thought brings a smile to his weathered face, a small, almost imperceptible shifting of the wrinkles around his eyes. He realizes that the sheath is more important than the blade, for the sheath is the context, the society, the law, and the code that keeps the danger contained. The sword remains sheathed not because there are no enemies, but because the samurai has realized that the only enemy worth fighting is the one that destroys harmony. The shadows in the room grow longer, merging with the corners, softening the edges of the furniture, turning the world into a blur of soft grays and blacks. The wind outside has died down, leaving the trees perfectly still, as if nature itself is pausing to honor the end of the story. The samurai feels a heaviness in his eyelids, a comfortable, warm weight that invites him to close his eyes and drift away. He is no longer the guardian on the wall. He is the stone of the wall itself, resting, enduring, existing. The tension that defined his life, the constant zansion or alertness, is finally beginning to unspool, relaxing into a state of profound release. He understands now that the peace he sought was never out there in the world, to be won with a treaty or a decree. It was always right here, inside the sheath, inside the pause between the breath, inside the decision to stay the hand. The sword is a sleeping dragon, and he is its keeper, and tonight both keeper and dragon will rest. The history of the samurai is often written in blood, but the history of this samurai is written in the invisible ink of the moments when nothing happened. The days when the sun rose and set without a single cry of pain, the years that passed in the quiet scratching of a pen and the bubbling of a tea kettle. This is the boring, beautiful truth of peace. It is the absence of the story we expect, replaced by the story of life simply continuing, breath after breath, heartbeat after heartbeat. As the last light fades from the room, leaving only the faint glow of the embers, the sword on the rack seems to disappear into the darkness, becoming one with the void, returning to the silence from which it was forged. The samurai closes his eyes, his breathing slow and rhythmic, matching the imaginary rise and fall of the sleeping blade. The metal rests, the wood rests, the man rests, the era rests.